Within hours, thousands of people start repeating the same story, even though none of them have seen the original document. And that's how her name came about. Among hundreds of pages, there was only one detail, an old email related to a charity event in Monaco. Nothing more. No trips recorded. No meeting confirmed. No participation. But online, the narrative was already in place before the explanation. Because today, context is optional. Association is sufficient. And when she realized she was being included in the conversation, decided to respond publicly. But what seemed like a simple correction ended up revealing something much bigger, not about the case itself. But it's about how stories are born on the internet. The detail that brought her name into the discussion wasn't a photo. It wasn't a date. Not even a travel log. It was a request. An email from 2013 mentioning transportation charity event in Monaco. Just that. No confirmation. Not even final planning. Don't even board. In fact, the recorded response was negative. The request simply didn't happen. But when this type of information reaches the internet, it doesn't remain a mere technical detail. She becomes a puzzle piece. And the audience begins to complete the rest on their own. Someone sees the name. Someone else posts a screenshot. Someone is interpreting another summary. And within a few hours, the abridged version becomes the accepted version. Most people never open the original document. They never read the full context, never check the attached response. Because the human mind prefers complete stories to incomplete facts. So, instead of a name mentioned in a rejected application, the narrative then becomes name linked to the case, and the more times this is repeated, the more real it seems, not because of evidence, but out of familiarity. This is how modern rumors work. They don't need to be convincing. They just need to be repeated. When she realized the magnitude of the problem, it was no longer a simple fix. It was a parallel version of reality circulating on its own. So she decided to do something rare these days, to explain before the story solidified. Live, but the explanation brought another unexpected problem. Because it wasn't just about clearing one's own name. It was about dismantling a logic that many people had already accepted. And that's almost never easy. When she decided to speak about it, it wasn't in an official statement. Not even through consulting. Not even in a calculated post. It was live. During the program, she brought up the exact segment where the name appeared. He read it word for word. And it became clear then, there was no scheduled meeting, no confirmed participation, and the request hadn't even been accepted. But the most interesting part wasn't the explanation. That was the reason she was explaining. She made it clear that she wasn't responding because of the document. I was responding because of the interpretation. According to her, people had already decided on the story before hearing any details. The name was enough. And that completely changed the focus of the conversation. Suddenly, it wasn't about the file itself anymore. It was about how someone can be included in a narrative simply by appearing in an administrative record. During the conversation, a question arose that summed it all up. If a name appears in a file, does that mean involvement? Or is it merely circumstantial proximity? Because archives record social, professional, and logistical connections, not intentions. But on the internet, these differences tend to disappear. While she was explaining, the online reaction remained divided. Some accepted the explanation immediately. Others began to argue even more. Not about the email, but regarding the concept of being listed, and then the story ceased to be an individual one. It turned into a bigger debate. To what extent does a mention become an accusation? And how long does it take for a suspicion to become collective memory? The answer seems to be almost instantly. But at that moment, it became clear that this was not an isolated case. Other names were also going through the same process. And that revealed something even more curious. These lists were being interpreted as engagement maps even, when they were merely contact records. When other names started appearing on the same pages, a pattern became clear. Most of them went there for prearranged meetings, but through indirect records. Orders placed by third parties. Invitations that were never fulfilled. Quotations in administrative conversations. Even so, the public effect was the same. Because the internet doesn't function like a court of law. It functions like an emotional puzzle. Each person picks up a piece of information and puts together the version that makes the most sense to her. The problem is that our brains prefer simple connections. Name plus document equals relationship. Relationship equals history. History equals truth. This is not an investigation. It's automatic interpretation. This phenomenon even has a predictable pattern. The more disturbing the subject matter, the less context people demand. The mind attempts to organize the chaos by creating quick narratives. And once created, the narrative begins to protect itself. New details cease to change the opinion. They only saw defense. That's exactly what happened. The discussion was no longer about the content of the email. It was about the meaning of showing up there. Some have begun to treat the list as direct evidence. Others began to question the very concept of proof. And then the story stopped being about a celebrity responding to something. It's become about reputation in the digital age. Because today, the order has changed. First, suspicion spreads. Then comes the explanation. And lastly, if it comes the context. But when the context arrives too late, he needs to compete with a story that has already been accepted. And accepted histories are difficult to erase. It was at this point that the conversation took a broader turn than any specific document. It was no longer about who was on the list. It was about what a list means. After that, the discussion stopped revolving solely around that specific case. Because many people realized that this could happen to any public figure. All it takes is an old record, an incomplete context. And the story begins to take shape on its own. In practice, documents have come to function as narrative triggers. It doesn't matter if they show participation, refusal, or only indirect contact. The public tends to remember only the association, and association is powerful. It doesn't depend on proof. It depends on repetition. When a name is linked to a subject multiple times, the brain stops differentiating between them. Mention of involvement. Memory only preserves proximity. Over time, the explanation fades. But the connection remains. That's why her public response ended up being more defensive than technical. It wasn't just about clarifying a detail. The goal was to prevent an incomplete version from becoming permanent. Because digital reputation works differently from traditional reputation. Previously, information needed to be confirmed before it could be circulated. Today, it only needs to be plausible. And once it proves plausible, it begins to live on its own. This creates a curious effect. The more someone explains, the more the story remains in the spotlight. Silence seems suspicious. The response seems to confirm the answer. And correction becomes a debate. In other words, there is no easy way out. That's when many people started to realize that the issue wasn't just a file. It was the modern mechanism of collective judgment. And this mechanism doesn't end when the news ends. It continues whenever someone remembers the name. That point the conversation was no longer about a specific document. It turned into a discussion about how trials happen today, because there is a huge difference between investigating and interpret. Investigating takes time. Interpretation is immediate, and the internet rewards instant gratification. When a complex file appears, nobody wants to wait days to understand it. People want an answer in minutes. Then the brain fills in the rest. Not out of malice, out of necessity. We were trained to organize information quickly. If something seems to make sense, we treat it as sufficient. The problem is that archives are not stories. They are fragments. But online, fragments need to become a narrative. And narratives need characters. Someone becomes the culprit. Someone becomes a defender. And someone becomes an example. Without understanding, the entire audience participates in the construction. Each share adds certainty. Each comment adds to the conviction. Until the original doubt disappears. And only the collective version remains. At this point, it hardly matters what actually happened. What matters is what has been repeated most often. That's why her response didn't just try to explain the email. He tried to interrupt the formation of the memory. Because once social memory is formed, it rarely reverts to a neutral state. The truth may come out later, but it's too late for a first impression. And first fingerprints are usually permanent. In the end, the story was never really about an email. Not even about a trip that never happened. Not even about a meeting that never happened. It was about something much more modern. How reputations are built and rebuilt in real time. Today, information doesn't need to be complete to become permanent. She just needs to circulate enough. A name appears. Someone is interpreting. Thousands repeat the experience. And when the explanation arrives, it doesn't find an empty space. You find a story that's already written. That's why this type of situation always leaves a strange feeling. Because nobody is discussing just facts. People are defending the version they heard first. The file remains the same. The context remains available, but perceptions have already changed. And perception is difficult to undo. Perhaps this is the most curious part of all. You don't need to participate in something to be remembered for it. You just have to show up close enough. In the past, stories depended on evidence. Today, they depend on association. And when association becomes collective memory, it begins to exist on its own, regardless of what actually happened. Ultimately, the case raised a bigger question than any document could in the digital era. People are judged by what they did, or what was easier to believe.